Okay, the story we're going to do today for our last scary story of this scary story foreshadowing unit is called the Wendego. It is from Scary Stories Treasury, which is Alvin Schwartz, who we've been talking about this whole time. This is from his first Scary Stories book, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. And when I was a kid, when I read this book, this is the story that stuck. Big time. Now, as I'm reading this, I'm doing what any good speaker or presenter does. I'm not reading it exactly. I'm reading it pretty close. So some of the things are going to be a little bit different. Okay? Are you ready?
Yeah.
Are you sure? Everybody is there? Take a deep breath.
If it's scary story, scare them down there.
Yeah.
If it's scary story, scare.
Alright. How about why don't I scare everybody equally?
Yeah.
Alright. The Wendego by Alvin Schwartz. A wealthy man wanted to go hunting in northern Canada where very few people hunted. He traveled north to a trading post and tried to find a guide to take him, but nobody would do it. They all said it was way too dangerous. And finally, he found a First Nationer. A First Nationer is a Native American in Canada. They call them First Nationers because they had the First Nation and then Europeans came over and stole it. So, they found this First Nationer who really needed some money, and this guy's name was DeFago. DeFago agreed that he would take this rich hunter out into the woods in northern Canada, and he was the only guy. So they go out and they make a camp near a large frozen lake. And they hunted for 3 days with nothing. They didn't even see anything. On the third night, up comes a windstorm. They lay in the tent in this frozen, frigid tundra, just listening to the windstorm and the trees whipping back and forth and the rattling of their tent. And to see if the storm got better, the hunter opens the tent, and what he saw stared at him. There was not a breath of air stirring. Nothing. The trees were standing really still. And yet, he still hears the wind just howling. Like you may as well be in a hurricane. Nothing outside is moving. And as he listens and listens, what he can hear startles him even more. It sounds like it's calling DeFago's name. DeFago. DeFago. And the hunter thinks, must be losing it. So, goes back inside the tent, but by this time DeFago is out of his sleeping bag. He's huddled in the corner of the tent, just curled up, rocking. His head's buried down in his arms. What is this all about? The hunter asks. It's nothing, says DeFago. Quick, it's nothing. But the wind keeps calling for him, and DeFago gets more and more tense and more restless, and he rocks, and he's just visibly terrified. DeFago. The sound is carried on the wind. Suddenly, he jumps to his feet, tears streaming down his face, and just sprints out, and he's gone. The hunter grabs a hold of him and just wrestles him and throws him to the ground. "You can't leave me out here," the hunter shouts. The wind calls him again, and DeFago fights him off and runs, just sprints off into the wilderness. And the hunter can hear him just screaming and screaming. Again and again, he cries, "Ah, my fiery feet! The burning feet! My feet are on fire!" And his voice fades away into the distance, screaming the same thing over and over. And at daybreak, the hunter follows his tracks through the snow. Since it was still night, even despite what it sounded like, his tracks are still in the snow. And as he goes in the woods, he goes down into the lake, he goes out onto the lake, but soon he starts to notice something really strange. The steps that DeFago had taken first started normal, like somebody was running, but as he went, they got further and backed further and further apart. And it was almost like something had grabbed hold of him and was carrying him step to step to step. It was something that had just helped him to get away as fast as he could. And the hunter follows the tracks out in the middle of the lake, but in the middle of the lake, the tracks just disappear. And at first he thought that DeFago had fallen through the ice, but there wasn't a hole. Even if it thought it would have frozen over, he would have been able to see something. And then he thought something may have like pulled him off the ice and just lifted him up into the sky, but that was ridiculous. It didn't make any sense. So he stood around wondering what was going to happen, and the wind picked up again. And soon it was really howling like he had before, and he heard DeFago's voice. It was coming from up above him. "My fiery feet! My burning feet!" He's screaming. But there was nothing. I mean, he looked around, he looked up. The voice was coming from above him, but there was nothing around. Now the hunter wanted to get out of the place as fast as he possibly could. So he heads back to camp, he packs up, he leaves some food out for DeFago in case DeFago's lost and comes back. And he started out. Weeks passed by of him walking, and finally, frozen and ragged and in terrible shape, makes it back to civilization. The following year, he went back to hunt the area again. He went to the same trading post, and the same people were there, and none of them could explain what happened to DeFago that night. But they'd not seen him since then. He never came back. Maybe it was the Wendego. One of the old men said, he was an old First Nationer, so he had, gray hair and a wrinkled face, and people looked up to this guy. And he laughed. Maybe it was the Wendego. It's supposed to come with the wind. It drags you along at great speed until your feet are burned. And as your feet burn, it keeps dragging you. And your whole body burns away after that. And it carries you up into the sky, screaming, and drops you. That's just a crazy, old story. But that's what some of the old First Nationers used to say. It's one of our legends. And a few days later, the hunters at the trading post again. And a First Nationer came and sat by a fire with a blanket wrapped around him. He wore a hat so you couldn't see his face. And the hunter looks at the guy and thinks there's something really familiar about him. So he leans in across the fire, looks at the guy with the hat, can't really see his face, and says, "Is your name DeFago?" And the First Nationer guy doesn't answer. "Do you know anything about him?" Still, no answer. He starts to wonder if something's wrong. Like the man needs help, if there's just something strange going on, but he can't see his face. So he leans in and says, Are you okay?" No answer. And to get a good look at him, the hunter takes the edge of the guy's hat and looks underneath. And then screams. Because underneath the hat, wrapped in the blanket, is nothing but a pile of ashes. Now, what about that story's foreshadowing? How did you know what was going to happen in the end before? Say.
As you would say, his body would eventually burn.
My fiery feet, right? And then, the old First Nationer guy starts to tell the story. And as soon as he starts to tell the story, you know what's going to happen, right? So, even though you knew the end of the story before you got to the end of the story, at least your brain could anticipate based on what the guy was saying or what Alvin Schwartz was telling you. Still a good story, right? You guys were going for a second. So that is the story that always stuck with me. Even though it's not the scariest in the book necessarily,